Welcome back to Sleepy Lorekeeper. Tonight we look at the life of a god born among men, a silent guardian who shaped humanity long before it knew his name. A father who forged 20 children from starfire and watched them rise, break, and burn the galaxy with their love and their grief. This is the story of the God Emperor of mankind, and those who once called him Father. There was a time when the world was young, and even the stars seemed unsure whether they wished to shine. And in that dawn, a single soul opened its eyes. I remember those first breaths of the world as one remembers a dream, not through detail, but through weight. Before memory was shaped into lines and symbols, before history hardened into tablets and scrolls, there was only the quiet pulse of existence, rain on warm earth, wind whispering across endless plains, fire struggling to rise from hands that had only just learned to shape it. It was in that age, long before empires scarred continents and before names were carved into monuments of stone, that the being who would become the emperor first walked among men. But he was not born. He arrived. 1,000 souls, perhaps 10,000, wove themselves together in an act of sacrifice unmatched in the long, violent anthology of our species. They were shamans, mystics, thinkers, wanderers of the psychic frontier. Each knew that their people stood at the brink of extinction, threatened by predators with fangs and predators with minds. And so, in a ritual lost to all but myth, they bound their spirits into one. Where once there had been many fragile flames, now stood a single, silent inferno. A child with the wisdom of ages, a being for whom death was no longer a possibility, but a distant echo. He began as a watcher, not a king, not a conqueror, not yet the god the galaxy would someday worship. Just a guardian whose name changed as languages rose and fell, as tribes became cities, and cities became kingdoms. He walked barefoot through ages where humanity was nothing more than a scattered collection of frightened, shivering creatures. He guided them not through commands, but through subtlety. A whisper at the edge of thought, a gentle hand on the course of fate. In those first millennia, he rarely revealed himself fully. To do so would have been to break the very thing he sought to protect. Humanity had to rise by its own will, not by the shadow of an immortal shepherd. So he walked unseen. He watched the first sparks of agriculture turn wandering clans into settlements. He felt the hum of the first tools, shaped from metal and stone. He walked along the rivers that would become motherlands of civilization, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile, the Indus, and nudged minds toward irrigation, architecture, language. Not enough to rule, just enough to guide. Civilizations rose in trembling confidence. Sumer carved symbols into wet clay, trying to trap meaning before it drifted away. Egypt, reached toward the heavens with architecture that defied mortality. Rome shaped law, Greece shaped thought, China shaped empire. In each of these stories, in murals, legends, and half-forgotten myths, a familiar figure appeared. A prophet, a warrior, a scholar, a stranger whose eyes seemed too old for his face. He was all of them, and none, for he could not stay. Time was his companion, but not his prison. He walked through eras the way mortals walk through rooms, leaving behind the faint scent of change. And all the while, humanity grew louder. Psychic potential, once a whisper, swelled into a chorus. Where primitive minds had barely grazed the edge of the immaterium, now countless souls pressed against it with fear, hope, love, grief, the full, overwhelming weight of sentient emotion. The warp listened. For the warp is not a place but a reflection, a great mirror of consciousness. What humanity felt, the immaterium absorbed. And what the immaterium absorbed, it amplified. At first, the echoes were faint, a flicker of emotion rebounding from the deep. A ripple across a sea so vast no mortal could sense its currents. But as civilizations grew, so too did the psychic pressure behind them. Every sorrow carved a wound in the warp. Every rage sparked a storm. Every longing for power, vengeance, or transcendence fed shapes that had not yet learned to call themselves gods. The Emperor saw it long before humanity understood the danger. He watched the warp awaken. He felt the first stirrings of sentience in the realm beyond flesh. He knew, with the quiet certainty of one who has lived many lifetimes, that someday the immaterium would give birth to horrors shaped by human frailty. And still, he did not intervene. Not fully. Not yet. Because humanity had to walk its own path, even if that path wound dangerously close to the abyss. It was a truth older than any empire. Salvation cannot be imposed. It must be chosen. So he continued to walk through ages that blurred together, observing the rise of tyranny and the rise of philosophy, both feeding the same psychic tide. He watched men forge gods in their own image, and those gods begin to take shape in the warp, hungry for emotion, waiting for the day they would erupt fully into reality. He walked through deserts where prophets preached mercy and empires preached conquest. He watched crusaders, conquerors, scholars, healers. He wandered battlefields soaked in blood and libraries filled with knowledge. He watched sparks of brilliance bloom and burn out in a single lifetime. He watched the slow climb of humanity toward something greater, and the shadow of its own nature chasing closely behind. By the Middle Ages, the warp was no longer quiet. By the Renaissance, it writhed. By the Age of Enlightenment, it screamed. By the Industrial Revolution, it began to tear. Humanity, without ever knowing it, was feeding the birth of gods made of emotion, beings that would one day devour entire civilizations in a heartbeat. And still, the Emperor stayed silent. Not because he was indifferent, but because he understood that the greatest danger came not from chaos itself, but from humanity's reliance on him. If he revealed himself too soon, mankind would become dependent, fragile, incapable of facing the coming storm. The species he loved would become a child clinging to the hem of a parent's robe, unable to stand, and thus unable to survive. So he watched, quietly, endlessly. Across centuries, he shaped humanity's path not through force, but through correction, removing obstacles, tempering disasters, allowing civilizations to fall when they needed to fall so that better ones could rise. He was both shepherd and judge, unseen but always present. Yet as humanity entered the age of strife, the silence of the warp was shattered. Psykers bloomed in numbers never before seen. Warp storms engulfed entire star systems. Human civilization fractured into isolated pockets of desperation. The Emperor wandered through that era, like a physician walking through a plague-ridden city. He saw Terra, his cradle, his charge, sink into barbarism, techno-feudalism, and madness. He saw nations crumble, their infrastructure failing under psychic storms and civil wars. He watched humanity nearly destroy itself, not through alien invasion or apocalyptic disaster, but through the raw, uncontrolled pressure of its own collective mind. And something changed in him. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, he knew that watching was no longer enough. Humanity was too vast, too loud, too fractured to guide from the shadows. Chaos had grown teeth. The warp had become a storm with no horizon, and the species he had shepherded for millennia was sinking beneath its own weight. So, after ages of restraint, he stepped forward, not as a legend, not as a whisper, not as a wandering philosopher, but as a ruler, a being who would no longer nudge history from behind, but seize it with both hands and shape it by force. He understood what humanity could become, and what it would become if he failed. A species lost to madness, a galaxy drowned in warp-born nightmares, a future consumed by gods that fed on all that humanity feared in itself. So he chose to stand between mankind and the abyss. And in doing so, the Eternal Watcher took the first step toward becoming the God Emperor of mankind, a being born from 1,000 souls, forged by millennia of patience, now preparing to lead a wounded species into the greatest war it would ever face. For the age of subtle guidance was over. The age of intervention had begun, and the first battlefield would be Terra itself. I remember Terra not as the cradle of mankind, but as its scar. Not the vibrant blue world painted on ancient star charts, nor the cradle sung of by poets long dead. When I walked its surface at the dawn of the age of strife, it was a place unrecognizable, a wounded sphere wrapped in storms of ash and radioactive dust, its oceans blackened, its skies fractured by the screaming remnants of failed technologies. Terra had once been a beacon of human ambition, a world that sent fleets of colony ships into the night, stitching the stars together with threads of hope. But that was long before the Psyker bloom, long before the warp storms tore apart the arteries of human civilization. When I returned to Terra with purpose rather than pilgrimage, it was a world that no longer remembered what it meant to be a beginning. It had become an ending. The continents were divided not by oceans, but by the fractured borders of techno-barbarian warlords. Steel fortresses jutted from poisoned plains like broken teeth. Megacities lay half-submerged in their own collapsed infrastructure. The atmosphere shimmered with pollution and the dim residue of ancient orbital bombardments. What had once been Venusian terraforming mirrors now drifted in unstable orbits as tumbling shards of glass and machinery, casting jagged patterns of dying light across the wasteland below. I walked this world as one who remembered its youth, the fertile valleys, the rivers that gleamed like liquid silver, the mountains that once carried forests upon their backs. Yet the Terra before me was a child mutilated by centuries of fear and neglect. It was not a homecoming. It was a warning. For the first time in ages, I understood the cost of waiting. The more humanity multiplied, the louder the warp had become. The louder the warp became, the more Psykers were born. The more Psykers emerged, the more Terra collapsed beneath the weight of uncontrolled psychic outbursts, demonic incursions, and civil wars born of sheer, unfiltered terror. Governments shattered. Technologies imploded. Cities drowned in storms of madness. Terra had become a mirror of the immaterium, cracked, storm-torn, and shrieking. And even when the world screamed for salvation, I could no longer remain silent. I did not announce myself with trumpets or prophecies. I did not descend from the heavens as the myths of later ages would claim. I simply stepped out of the shadows and into history, and history, broken and starving, took notice. I began in the whispering ruins of the Pan-Pacific territories, among tribes who had forgotten their own names beneath layers of radiation dust and rusting armor. They worshipped warlords as gods because they no longer remembered the difference between divinity and violence. I saw children whose first memory was the recoil of a weapon, who had never touched clean water, who believed the sky had always been the color of blood. It was there, in the shattered east of Terra, that my first true army was born. Not of idealists, not of volunteers, but of engineered warriors who were never meant to survive the peace that would follow. The Thunder Warriors. Their creation haunts me still. They were humanity's first step toward engineered perfection, larger, stronger, fiercer than any natural-born soldier. Their minds burned with single-minded purpose, their bodies sculpted to endure the horrors Terra would unleash upon them. They were not elegant. They were not subtle. They were weapons forged for one task: the brutal unification of a world that had forgotten unity. I remember watching them march across the bone-white plains of old Albia, their armor forged from reclaimed plates of ancient war machines, their visors glowing with the amber light of chemically enhanced fury. They waded through the broken remains of warlords who had carved their names into mountains with atomic fire. They tore down tyrants who had enslaved entire regions with cybernetic control networks. They became legends and monsters in the very same breath. And through it all, I walked behind them, for I had no need to stand at the front. The wars of Terra were not battles of strategy or glory. They were surgeries performed on a dying world. Every fortress we razed was an infected wound opened and cauterized. Every tyrant toppled was a malignant growth removed. Every city reclaimed was a fragment of humanity's memory stitched back into place. Yet even as we reclaimed the soil piece by piece, Terra did not thank us. It trembled beneath our feet, as if unsure whether it wished to survive. I remember the wasteland of Pan-Pacific as a labyrinth of shattered arcologies stretching beyond the horizon. Each time, the Thunder Warriors advanced, storms of static lightning erupted across the sky, the remnants of malfunctioning geo-engines left to decay for centuries. The air buzzed with electromagnetic fury. Concrete shells of once proud megastructures toppled under the shockwaves. The very ground shook with the echo of past tragedies. Warlords emerged from these ruins like insects from a corpse, each claiming dominion over territories that were nothing more than toxic scars. Some wielded corrupted technologies, scavenged from the dark age of technology. Plasma rifles held together with prayer and wire, exosuits powered by unstable reactors, cybernetic implants that fused flesh and machine into grotesque mockeries of progress. Others relied on brute force, shaping their armies from tribes who had never seen the sun through the smog. The Thunder Warriors crushed them all. But with each victory, I felt the weight of inevitability pressing down upon me. The Thunder Warriors were not sustainable. Their biology burned too brightly, too violently. They were dying even as they conquered. Their very existence was a temporary flame meant to illuminate the darkest passages of Terra's despair. And as they died, not from wounds, but from the strain of their own engineered nature, I knew they could not accompany humanity into the future I envisioned. Unity demanded more than strength. It demanded longevity. It demanded stability. It demanded sons who would endure. But that truth lay ahead, in years I had not yet shaped. For now, Terra continued to bleed. We marched across the shattered Eurasian plains, where armies clashed atop the rusting hulks of long-dead titans. Their colossal frames lay half-buried in the soil, like the skeletons of extinct gods. Some still hummed with leftover reactor energy, casting ghostly light through the storms. Others had fused with the environment, overgrown with metallic vines and nanite-corroded stone. The ground itself seemed to remember their last battles. In the Nordic regions, tribes worshipped malfunctioning machines as divine relics. In the African techno-empires, emperors ruled with neural crowns linked to weather control towers that flickered erratically with warp-scarred energy. In the shattered remains of Austrasia, Cannibalistic war clans prowled the ruins of pre-strife research complexes, their bodies altered by unstable genetic experiments. Everywhere I turned, I saw reflections of humanity's brilliance, twisted into horrors by centuries of isolation and fear. Yet slowly, painfully, the world began to change. When the Pan-Pacific tyrants fell, the storms above their lands softened. When the Albia warlords were broken, the rivers around them cleared of the chemical runoff that had stained them for generations. When the last techno-feudal stronghold crumbled, the thundering in the warp quieted, as if humanity's collective mind took a steadying breath. Terra was beginning to remember itself. But it was Mars that completed the transformation. I had known for ages that the Red World would be vital, the cradle of lost knowledge, the repository of technologies safeguarded through faith as much as through engineering. I walked its desolate dunes beneath skies tinted with copper dust, and met the priesthood of the machine god, who had kept the memory of humanity's golden age alive through ritual and devotion. They greeted me not with fear, but with reverence. They saw me not as a king, nor as a conqueror. They saw me as the Omniscia, the embodiment of the union between divinity and machine. And for the first time in tens of thousands of years, humanity's two greatest strongholds, Terra and Mars, forged a pact. Not of subjugation, not of convenience, but of shared purpose. Together, we would rebuild the Imperium. Together, we would reclaim the stars. But even as the dust settled upon the last battlefields of Terra, I understood that victory was only the beginning. The world lay unified, but not healed. It was a mosaic of shattered cultures stitched together with blood and steel. Its air was still toxic. Its cities lay in ruin. Its people bore scars that would take generations to fade. And beneath this fragile calm, the warp storm still rumbled. Humanity had found its ruler. Terra had found its unity. But the galaxy remained fractured by chaos, isolation, and fear. The unification wars were not the end of Terra's suffering. They were merely the foundation upon which a new age would be built, an age that would demand suns far greater than the Thunder Warriors, ships that could navigate the storms of the warp, and a leader who could bear the weight of both light and shadow. As I walked the reclaimed surface of Terra, through fields of ash and ancestral dust, I knew the truth. The last war of Terra had ended, but the Great Crusade had already begun. Not among the stars, but within my own design. For humanity would need more than survival. It would need champions. And soon, my sons would awaken. Before there were legions, before there were empires reborn, there were only dreams. Dreams of a future written in gene code and starlight. Dreams shaped into the outline of 20 sons waiting to be born. I had unified Terra. I had bound Mars to my purpose. I had forged peace from ruin and silence, from the roaring chaos of a world at war with itself. Yet even as the last ashes of the unification wars settled, I knew that what I had made was not a destination. It was only a platform, a launch pad perched on the edge of an abyss. Humanity was still scattered across the stars. Worlds once connected by stable warp routes were now isolated islands. Some had fallen into barbarism. Some had vanished beneath alien rule. Some had grown strong and proud, forgetful that they had ever been children of Terra. To mend that broken web, I would need more than armies. I would need symbols. I would need living answers to the chaos that threatened to devour mankind. The Thunder Warriors had been tools of necessity. Their design had been brutal, efficient, and terminal. They were not meant to endure. Their purpose had ended with Terra. I would not build the future of humanity on foundations that were already crumbling. So I turned to a deeper kind of creation. From the vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, buried in strata older than most surface civilizations, I began the greatest work of my long existence. Not the conquest of a world, nor the toppling of a tyrant, but the crafting of lives that would become the pillars of an age. The Primarch Project. To many, it would later seem like an act of arrogance. To forge sons in the image of an immortal mind, to shape warriors who could stride across battlefields like demigods. But it was not pride that guided my hands. It was necessity, sharpened by millennia of observation. Humanity needed figures who could be followed, loved, feared, and believed in. More than generals, more than rulers. Icons. I designed each one with care that bordered on reverence. From my own genetic and psychic template, I spun 20 patterns, not duplicates, and never mere copies. Each was a facet of myself, separated and amplified. Strength without end. Resolve that would never bend. Intellect that could chart campaigns across star clusters. Charisma that could weld fractured cultures into coherent legions. Compassion, ruthlessness, curiosity, faith, doubt. I took what I had learned from ages of watching mankind, and I distilled those qualities into living beings. Each Primarch was a question I asked myself about the nature of leadership. What would unshakable loyalty look like if given a body? What would relentless logic become if given a voice? What would untempered faith do if given the power to shape worlds? Inside the gestation pods, they grew in silence. I remember the chambers, bathed in dim golden light, filled with the rhythmic pulsing of life that was more than human. Stasis fields shimmered. Bioreactors fed precise pulses of energy into the forming bodies. Information, knowledge, and subtle psychic conditioning flowed into developing minds. These were not children in the mortal sense. They were architectures of destiny. For a moment, in those quiet vaults, I allowed myself something I had not felt in many ages: hope. And then, the warp reached in. The attack did not come with noise, nor with the blazing spectacle of an invading army. It came as the faintest tremor, the kind I had spent millennia sensing in the shadows of reality. A distortion at the edge of perception. a breath drawn by something that had been watching my work with hungry fascination. Chaos had grown in tandem with humanity. It had feasted on our fears, drunk from our hatred, and clothed itself in the most destructive forms of our desire. It had watched me for ages, just as I had watched mankind, and it understood that the Primarchs were more than soldiers. They were fulcrums. If I succeeded, they would unify the species and dim the light of chaos by giving humanity direction and stability. If I failed, they would become the greatest weapons the warp had ever wielded. So the warp struck. Reality twisted around the gestation chambers. Geometry bent. Time skipped. What had been stable fields of carefully controlled energy became conduits for forces no mortal science could predict. I felt the surge rise from the depth of the immaterium, a tide swollen by demonic intent, and the collective subconscious of a species balanced between fear and hope. The pods were wrenched away. In a blink that stretched into an eternity, 20 perfect, unfinished destinies were dragged out into the turbulent currents of the warp and scattered across the galaxy. Worlds far from Terra, some barely clinging to life, others thriving in isolation, became cradles for beings who were never meant to know separation. My sons were torn from me before they were even born. The silence that followed was deeper than any battlefield I had walked. In those hidden vaults, surrounded by machines and empty sockets where the pods had been, I understood the scale of what had been done. The Primarchs would still live, because they had been designed to endure. Their biology and their psychic imprinting would protect them. But they would grow far from my guidance, shaped by alien skies, strange cultures, and the ever-present whisper of the warp that had stolen them. I had intended them to be answers. Instead, they became questions I no longer controlled. I did not rage. I had lived too long for that. I simply adjusted. From the genetic matrices and design principles I had forged for the Primarchs, I created something new. A second generation of warriors. Less grand, less vast, but more numerous. Where the Primarchs were singular beacons, these would be legions of stars, each burning with a fragment of the same light. The Space Marines. The Adeptus Astartes. I took the template of my lost sons and distilled it into a form that could be replicated. Gene seed organs, implants, surgical procedures that could transform a baseline human into a transhuman warrior. Taller, stronger, faster, almost impossibly resilient, bound together not by common ancestry, but by the will to serve the Imperium. They would be my soldiers during the Great Crusade, and someday they would be reunited with the Primarchs, whom they were made to follow. As the first legions marched from Terra, armor gleaming with fresh heraldry, banners unrolled to the bitter winds of a scarred world, I felt a strange convergence of loss and anticipation. They were not my sons, not in the way the Primarchs were, yet they were still my work, my responsibility, my chosen instruments. They would go where I could not be present at all times. They would carry my dream into places my physical form would never stand. Each legion would be given its own character, its own doctrine, its own echo of the missing father that had been stolen by the warp. And somewhere, out in the dark, my true sons were growing. Some were raised by warlords, their strength honed by constant conflict. Some were found by peaceful civilizations, learning art and philosophy beside martial skill. Some were abandoned in desolation and learned early that survival is the harshest teacher. Some were worshipped as gods before they ever knew their own name. Each Primarch became a reflection of the world that had found him, and in that, chaos had done something it had not intended. It had created diversity. For when I began the Great Crusade, when my fleets rose like silver storms from Terra and Mars, I sought not only lost human colonies, but the echoes of my stolen work. I searched for my sons. The first reunions were strange and quiet things, no matter what later legends would describe. It was not the thunder of trumpets that defined them, but the subtle shift in the psychic fabric when two designs, long separated, finally stood in one another's shadow. Each time I found a Primarch, I discovered not only what he had become, but what he revealed about me. One son embodied unstoppable loyalty, forged in a culture that valued brotherhood above all things. Another embodied relentless logic, shaped by a world of iron fortresses and siege warfare. A third was suffused with faith and longing, molded by a people who saw the divine in every flicker of light. It created the seeds. The galaxy had authored the stories. Reunion did not erase the years of separation. It could not undo the scars of those formative experiences. It simply redirected them. I offered each son a place, a legion to command, a role within the greater design of the Imperium. Some accepted with fierce joy, some with measured contemplation, some with an eagerness that concealed deeper fractures. I watched how they treated their Astartes, these second sons who carried gene seed based on the Primarch's own essence. Some Primarchs ruled their legions like families, others like machines of war, others like religious orders. Through them, I could see the trajectories their souls would eventually trace. Pride stirred, but so did unease. For every admirable quality, there was a corresponding shadow. In the one who embodied loyalty, there was also the capacity to follow the wrong cause to the very end. In the one who embodied logic, there was the seed of cold cruelty and disdain for weakness. In the one who embodied faith, there was the danger of worship turning not toward purpose, but toward idols. My sons were my greatest triumph, but they were also amplifications of human nature. And human nature, I knew better than anyone, contained both the drive to build and the impulse to destroy. Yet there was no turning back. The Great Crusade moved ever outward. With each new world brought into compliance, each lost colony reclaimed, each alien threat burned away. The Primarchs grew into legends. Their stories spread faster than their fleets. Whole populations spoke of them as if they were ancient myths reborn. The idea of them became as powerful as their physical presence. I watched this carefully. I had always intended the Imperium to be secular in structure, rational in policy, guided by law and reason rather than superstition. For centuries, I had opposed the rise of gods, knowing all too well that the warp would eagerly devour such worship and twist it into chains. Yet, ironically, my own sons began to accumulate devotion that mirrored the very dynamics I had sought to prevent. They became more than commanders. They became objects of belief. Some resisted this. Some encouraged it. Some were indifferent, focused entirely on their campaigns. And through it all, I remained at the center, the silent axis around which the storm of history turned. There were brief moments, rare and fragile, when I allowed myself to imagine the Imperium as it might be if everything went according to plan. The Primarchs, united and stable, guiding their legions with wisdom and restraint. The Astartes forging a bulwark of security across human space. Technology and order replacing superstition and fear. The warp tamed, if not fully understood. Humanity standing tall, no longer prey to its own nightmares. But I had lived too long to be blind to the currents swirling beneath the surface. My sons were not puppets. They were not mere creations. They were individuals with histories, loves, hates, insecurities, and scars. Some longed for my approval, shaping entire campaigns around the need to be recognized. Others bristled at the constraints of the Imperium, seeing in its structure a cage rather than a path. Still others harbored wounds from their childhoods on alien worlds, wounds they did not know how to name, but which would one day roar to life within the psychic pressure of the Great Crusade. I had forged them to be strong. I had not forged them to be simple. As the fleets pressed further into the void, as map after map shifted from contested to compliant, a strange tension threaded through the triumph. We were winning. Humanity was being gathered back into a single, vast empire. Yet for every world freed from isolation, another weight settled on my shoulders. Because I knew that the greatest threats are not always external. Sometimes they are the very tools you wield. The Primarchs were not only my sons. They were also my reflection. In their pride, I saw echoes of my own conceits. In their ambition, I saw my willingness to reshape galaxies. In their doubts, I saw the shadows I had long kept buried. They were my children, born of starfire and gene code, scattered by chaos, reclaimed by destiny. They were the brightest lights I had ever seen cast upon the darkness. And in the penumbra of those lights, the first hints of a coming eclipse began to form. For a time, the galaxy only saw the brilliance, the victories, the banners, the golden age of conquest. But I felt the fault lines deep beneath it all, waiting, patient, inevitable. The Eternal Watcher had become a father. The Father had forged his sons. The sons had found their legions, and soon the dream we had written together would be tested in flame. The stars opened like ancient gates, and for a moment humanity remembered how to hope. The Great Crusade began not with trumpets, nor with proclamations carved into monuments of stone, but with a silence so vast it seemed to swallow the breath of the galaxy. It began when the fleets of Terra, long dormant, long imprisoned by the storms of the warp, rose again into the cold night, their hulls gleaming like newly forged blades. I remember watching the first ships ascend from the plateaus of the Imperial Palace, engines burning with a light not seen for centuries. Columns of flame licked the smog-darkened skies. Dust storms chased their ascent, turning the air into swirling gold. For the first time since the Age of Strife began, Terra was no longer a prison. It was a beginning. The Mechanicum's forges thundered with renewed purpose, their hymns echoing across the void. Massive shipyards shaped vessels meant not merely for war, but for reunion, to bridge the scattered fragments of humankind across a galaxy scarred by millennia of isolation. Across Terra, the legions gathered. Armored giants stood in endless formation, their gene-forged hearts beating in perfect rhythm. Standards rose, heraldry glimmered, war chants rumbled like distant thunder. They were the Imperium's answer to the long night, its promise that humanity would no longer crawl in the shadows of dead civilizations. And above them all, guiding them silently, I walked. The time had come to reclaim what had been lost, not only worlds, but purpose. The crusade spread outward like a shockwave. Planet after planet fell into the shadow of imperial compliance, some willingly, some begrudgingly, some after bitter conflict that left scars still felt 10,000 years later. Yet through victory after victory, a deeper current flowed beneath the surface. For every world conquered, for every banner raised upon alien soil, another search continued. The search for my sons. Each Primarch was a beacon in the warp, a signature of psychic resonance so distinct I could feel their presence long before my fleets reached their worlds. They were my children, scattered, reshaped by fate, waiting without knowing they were waiting. The first reunions changed everything. The moment a Primarch stood aboard his flagship for the first time, the Legion crafted from his genetic legacy transformed. Ranks straightened, morale surged, doctrine shifted to match his temperament. The Astartes became not merely soldiers, but extensions of a singular will, harmonizing with a resonance they had felt in their blood since their creation. One by one, my sons returned to me, not as infants, not as blank slates, but as men forged by alien suns. Some came with open arms, hearts on fire with purpose, Some came with caution, keen minds evaluating the intentions of the father they had never known. Some came as conquerors, proud of what they had built in their exile. Others came as wounded creatures, shaped by the cruelties of worlds that had no concept of a God-made child. I embraced them all, outwardly with warmth, inwardly with calculation. For every Primarch, no matter how noble, carried within him the fracture of his origin. None of them were what I had intended them to be. None of them had grown beneath my guidance. But they were still mine. The crusade surged forward with renewed vigor. Where once the Thunder Warriors had been instruments of brutal necessity, the Primarchs were instruments of destiny. They were brilliant in ways no natural-born leader could match, each one a living constellation around which entire campaigns formed. Horus, the brightest star, led fleets that moved with impossible coordination, turning wars into elegant maneuvers of inevitability. Rabut Guilliman built bureaucracies and structures that could govern entire subsectors with the precision of a master artisan. Leman Russ cleaved through threats with a ferocity that bordered on myth. Rogel Dorn carved fortresses into planet-side stone, as if obeying blueprints etched into his very soul. Perturabo built and broke fortifications with equal mastery, his mind an unending siege engine. Each son carried a different fragment of war, government, philosophy, or faith. And with each victory, the Imperium grew not only larger, but more certain. For a time, a brief, golden time, it appeared that humanity might truly outrun its own shadows. Yet beneath the surface, the warp watched. For the warp was always watching. Every triumph stirred pride in the hearts of brothers who had never learned to share. Every reunion kindled rivalries fed by years of isolation. Every world brought into compliance revealed differences in doctrine, ideology, or ambition. The Primarchs were not identical. They were reflections, sometimes distorted, sometimes sharpened, of qualities I had spent millennia refining within myself. Qualities that had allowed me to endure. Qualities that, in isolation, could become flaws. Lorgar searched endlessly for meaning. Horus sought love and approval. Ferrus Manus saw weakness everywhere. Vulcan clung to hope, even in the darkest fires. Magnus believed knowledge could exorcise fear. Korax carried guilt like a chain wrapped around his spirit. In each of them, I saw a path that humanity might take. In each of them, I also saw a warning. Humanity needed unity, but the Primarchs, for all their brilliance, were not unified. Still, the crusade marched on. I remember the worlds we reclaimed, some like dim embers, others like shattered mirrors, reflecting only the trauma of their isolation. One world welcomed us with open arms, its population still clinging to the last faded memories of Terra's ancient transmissions. Another met us with silence, its cities empty, its oceans boiling. the last remnants of life devoured by Xenos predators whose bones calcified beneath the scorching sun. Another resisted fiercely, its leaders insisting they were the true heirs of humanity, its armies wielding corrupted war machines fueled by technologies they did not fully understand. And yet another attacked us without hesitation, fearing us as invaders because they had forgotten what it meant to belong to something greater. Every world was a story. Every population, a reminder of humanity's potential to rise or fall. Every campaign, a lesson written in ash and hope. But through it all, my sons grew. They grew as commanders, as symbols, as legends, and in ways I had not planned. Some forged bonds of brotherhood so deep they felt like forgiveness knitted into destiny. Some grew jealous of how the galaxy whispered one brother's name more than another's. Some questioned my orders, seeing in them flaws they believed they could fix. Some simply longed to return to the lives they had built before I found them. The galaxy celebrated the Great Crusade as the rebirth of humanity, but I saw the cracks widening. When I finally returned to Terra, it was not in triumph. It was out of necessity. The Webway project had become my singular focus, a dream older than the Imperium itself, older even than the Age of Strife. A network of stable gateways that could bypass the warp entirely. A future in which humanity no longer had to bend knee to the tides of chaos. It was the work of a being who had lived too long, who understood the cost of every century lost to madness. It was my attempt to build a future that did not rely on my own immortality. But to complete it, I had to withdraw from the crusade. I had to leave my sons to lead without me. And they felt it. One by one, the Primarchs looked back at Terra and felt the weight of abandonment, even if they could not name it. They had grown under my gaze, their triumphs shaped by the knowledge that I walked behind them. When I stepped away, they felt something shift in the marrow of the Imperium. Some grew restless, some grew ambitious, some grew afraid. Horus, especially, felt the void most keenly. He had been the first found, the brightest. The one I entrusted with the mantle of War Master. The one I had loved not more, but differently, because he had grown so quickly into the leader I had hoped he would become. In the vacuum I left behind, chaos did what chaos always does. It whispered, not with noise, but with validation, not with threats, but with promises, not with hatred, but with love. The crusade continued without me, but something essential had shifted. Where once the Imperium had marched in harmonious unity, it now marched in the flickering light of jealousy, pride, and misunderstanding. What had been a golden age became something strained, brittle, and dangerous. Yet the galaxy did not see it. History rarely notices fractures until they widen into canyons. It saw only the monuments, the victories, the return of human dominion across thousands of stars. It saw the Imperium shining like a sunrise breaking over a world that had long forgotten warmth. I saw something different. I saw sons who had become legends before they had learned how to be men. I saw a father who had stepped aside too soon, driven by a dream too vast for mortal hearts to understand. I saw a future trembling beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when hope and pride would collide. The Great Crusade was humanity's greatest story. It was also the beginning of its greatest wound. And as I worked deep beneath Terra, carving gateways through reality itself, I felt the first tremors of the tragedy that would soon unfold. The dream I had written in flame was burning too brightly, and bright flames, when left untended, cast very long shadows. In the end, it was not hatred that broke the Imperium, but love twisted by the warp into something unrecognizable. That is the truth most histories refuse to whisper. The Horus Heresy is often described as a war of gods, a clash of titans, a civil war that consumed 1,000,000 worlds. But beneath the cataclysm, beneath the burning of stars and the screams of civilizations caught between warring demigods, was something far simpler, a wound in a family, a wound that had been forming long before the first shot was fired, long before Horus stood upon Davin, long before Lorgar knelt in humiliation, long before Magnus broke the veil, long before the seeds of doubt, jealousy, misunderstanding, and longing grew into thorns. It began with 20 sons crafted from starfire, and a father who had hoped they would never need to know what loneliness felt like. The Great Crusade had been a symphony, a shining arc of triumph that echoed across the galaxy. For years, the Primarchs had fought side by side, each bringing his own light to the vast tapestry of humanity's rebirth. They won thousands of worlds. They silenced alien threats that had preyed on human colonies for millennia. They raised monuments, forged alliances, and carried humanity out of the dark age that had nearly killed it. But with success came hunger. Not for conquest, but for meaning. The Primarchs had been created with purpose baked into their marrow. To lead, to build, to be seen, to be recognized by the Father who had shaped them. And yet as the Imperium grew, the Emperor pulled back. He left the crusade to Horus. He withdrew into the depths of Terra to pursue the Webway project, a dream so vast even his brightest sons could not fully comprehend it. To them, it looked like abandonment. It looked like a father turning his face away, just as his children accomplished the very deeds he had demanded of them. Horus felt it most keenly. I remember him, not as War Master, not as the betrayer of humanity, but as he was in the beginning, brilliant, gentle, fiercely loyal, the brightest of the Primarchs, the one with an instinctive understanding of people, of their fears, their hopes, their needs. He was a leader not simply by design, but by empathy. And because he felt deeply, he also fractured deeply. When I look back across the centuries, I do not see the heresy beginning in a single moment. I see millions of small ones. I see the quiet doubt when he watched me depart Terra without explanation. I see the sting of envy when other sons received praise he felt he had earned. I see the burden of War Master closing around him like a tightening chain. I see brothers whispering in the dark corners of fleets, their insecurities feeding his own. And I see chaos, watching with patient hunger. Horus was not corrupted through power. He was corrupted through love. Love of humanity, love of his brothers, love of a father he feared he had disappointed. All were turned against him by the warp, twisted into a narrative in which betrayal looked like salvation and rebellion looked like mercy. Chaos offered him not glory, but validation, not dominance, but understanding, not threats, but sympathy. And in the depths of the warp, where emotion shapes reality, that was enough. The fall of one son became the fracture of a family. Lorgar, wounded by my condemnation of his worship, became fertile ground for belief that promised to elevate him. Fulgrim, entranced by perfection, slipped into a reflection of his own brilliance. Perturabo's bitterness, long simmering beneath the weight of unappreciated labor, became open resentment. Mortarian's hatred of tyranny twisted into an obedience to something far darker than any warlord on Barbarous. Angron's rage, never allowed to heal, became a chain that dragged entire worlds into ruin. Even Magnus, loyal, brilliant Magnus, attempted to save the Imperium in a single desperate act, and in doing so, accelerated its destruction. His breach of the webway did not merely collapse a gateway, it shattered trust. The suns were drifting. The dream was dimming. And for the first time in ages, the Emperor stood not at the edge of destiny, but in its center. The galaxy burned. The opening strikes of the heresy were not battles, but amputations. Entire legions torn from the body of the Imperium. Worlds that had once sung hymns to unity now choked on betrayal. Fleets that had once sailed under the same banners now hunted one another like predators circling wounded prey. I remember the fall of Istvan III, Istvan V, shattered alliances, burning skies, brothers killing brothers on fields soaked in the blood of those they had sworn to protect. The warp storms grew with every death, every doubt, every scream that echoed through the immaterium. Humanity's collective trauma became fuel for demons shaped from thought and desire. The nightmares of millions took form, clawing their way into reality. The crusade that had once united the species now tore it apart faster than any alien empire ever could. And at the center of the storm, Terra waited. For all wounds lead back to the heart. The battle for Terra did not begin when the traitor fleets appeared in the sky. It began years before, in every unspoken fear, every wounded ego, every fracture left to widen. But when the fleets arrived, reality finally mirrored the pain that had been festering so long. I remember the shadows of ships falling across the Himalayan mountains. I remember the tremors as titans marched through the gates of my palace. I remember the sky bleeding fire as drop pods rained like meteors. I remember the screams of civilians crushed between forces greater than comprehension. The imperial palace, once a monument to unity, became a tomb waiting to be filled. My sons fought one another on its walls. Friends became executioners. Legions that had bled together on 1,000 worlds now tore each other apart in hallways lined with gold. The defenses I had built over centuries groaned under the weight of the greatest siege in human history. Dorne's battlements cracked. Sanguinius's wings were stained with the ash of millions. The Custodes and Sisters of Silence fought, in silence so profound it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Even Russ, even Gilliman, even the Iron Hands could not reach Terra in time. Fate had sealed the board with brutal efficiency. It came down to a father and a son. The final confrontation on the vengeful spirit has been described countless times, in text, in song, in forbidden scripture. But none capture what truly happened. They describe it as a duel. It was not a duel. It was grief made manifest. Horus, once radiant, now burned with a darkness that had torn away all softness, all gentleness, leaving only a hollow echo of the son he had been. The Emperor did not approach him as a god, or as a general, or as a conqueror. He approached him as a father walking toward the child he had failed. Horus struck with the fury of one who believed betrayal was love. The Emperor endured with the sorrow of one who believed love should have saved them. In that chamber, amidst the corpses of those who had followed Horus into damnation, I felt something I had not felt since the dawn of my existence. Regret for the sons I had created, regret for the burdens I had given them, regret for the path I had chosen, one paved with sacrifice that they had never asked to bear. When the final blow was struck, it was not fueled by anger. It was fueled by despair. Horus died not as a monster or a traitor, but as a son whose choices had broken him long before they broke the galaxy. And in killing him, the Emperor's last human piece died as well. What followed was not victory. It was an ending. The Emperor was carried to the Golden Throne, a device never meant to sustain life, but to cage it. The Webway project had died with Magnus's breach. The dream of an Imperium free from the warp was extinguished. There was no future left but stagnation. And so, the last true god of mankind was entombed in machinery that would preserve his body while devouring his soul, one endless second at a time. His sons scattered, the loyal broken, the traitors damned. Legions dissolved. Worlds turned to ash The Imperium survived, but only just, and the wound carved by the heresy has never healed. Not in 10,000 years. Not in any age to come. For how can a wound heal when the heart that must mend it is nailed forever to a throne of pain? The galaxy remembers the heresy as a war, but I remember it as a story of sons searching for meaning, and a father who tried to save them by hiding the truths they needed most. In the quiet after the storm, when the fires dimmed and the screams faded, all that remained were echoes, some faithful, some fallen, some legends, some curses. But every one of them, every Primarch, every legion, every tragedy, was only a shadow cast by the man who had created them. A god born among men, a father who forged his children from starfire and sorrow, a dream that burned too brightly, a wound that will never heal. If you're still here, maybe start the next episode. Or just let the quiet take you. And if you've already drifted off, that's all right. Good night, traveler. Sleep well beneath the stars.